Thanks, Sue. Yeah, what we wanted to talk about this morning really is something that we've seen coming up in our work more and more. And that's really just helping clients and consumer brands out there understand whether the behaviors that they're seeing are part of a kind of wider trend, or whether or not, it's a short-term fad and something that they should, align their business with, some business investment, and helping them understand, what are the factors at play, what are the forces that are influencing these behaviors, and whether these shifts are here to stay or whether they're, very simply a flash in the pan. And obviously, for the organizations and for the work that we do, if we do identify them as trends, are these behaviors that require a much deeper and more immersive understanding and investigation in them. So what we wanted to talk to a little bit about today is some frameworks that we've got to help clients identify whether it's a trend, whether it's a fad, and we're going to use a couple of examples of the work that we do in and around diversity and inclusion to express that.
So yes, it got us thinking really about what makes a behavior part of a trend. What's a trend versus what's a fad? And it's not something that you can simply ask participants in a focus group or in an interview, because asking questions about culture it's like asking people to describe something that they take so much for granted. It's really hard for them to articulate it. It doesn't mean that you don't ask participants about what it feels like to breathe in this case, but you can't rely only on that to make sense of what's happening. So we thought about what makes a trend, and it seems to us that there are a number of factors. So the first thing is that a trend, unlike a fad, is really underpinned by a range of structural causes. So there's a legal context that is clearly, typically very long-term, that has at least national implications. You've got a law that's going to apply to a whole country. You've got economic factors that can have to do with the mode of production, with the level of income that people have, disposable income. Demographic trends, so how the population profile is changing, an aging population, a diversifying population, demographic factors. Then, of course, political changes and technological changes. So what makes an empirical phenomenon part of a wider trend is that it is supported or sustained or caused by this conflation of trends.
So yeah, Ray here. And I'm guessing that if we take something like veganism, which is going on all around us at the moment, we can see the technologies at play where it's possible to make more products that are vegan. We have this political shift. We have the whole population problem, the economics of producing meat. And we're beginning to see two types of, I think, legal things going on. One is making things possible, but the other is trying to ban anything using the word burger that doesn't have meat, banning the word sausage if it doesn't have meat. So this kind of forward legal stuff which promote a trend, and then perhaps there will almost always be negative stuff to say, if there are people who are making the effort to stop this, then actually it's probably more of a trend.
That's a really interesting example of veganism. And in fact, I think about a week or two ago, there's a lawyer, Peter Daly is his name, who managed to establish veganism as an ethical belief that is on the same footing as a religious belief. And so veganism will be protected by law, which is going to completely change what is perhaps perceived as a fad by many people who are not vegan, and turn it into a very long-term enduring trend, right? Indeed protected by law. So
and have its economic consequences.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, yes.
So there's kind of this conflation of trends which have to extend over time. So it's a trend is not something that has no longevity, right? It has to extend over time. And it also is all the more powerful if it has geographical reach, if it's in not just in one area, but in a number of markets, for example. So that's kind of how we came to define a trend. I'm sure there are other definitions, other ways of thinking about that, but that's how we approach it in our team. We're also interested in how trends meet deep human needs, because you can have, you know, new products, new services that are popular for a while, but if they don't meet enduring human needs, they're much less likely to have longevity and to spread, right? So of the human needs, we were drawing on an old kind of established typology of human needs from the 60s. I think the man is William Glasser, 1965, I believe, is the original work on this. But he identifies, I think rightly, the following needs. So the need for power and influence, the need for love and belonging, the need for safety, for learning and growing. That's kind of similar to self-actualization, if for those who are familiar more with Maslow's kind of hierarchy of needs. And the need for freedom, freedom to do stuff and freedom from various constraints. So a product, a service, a trend will, to last, will meet deep human needs. So in the case of veganism, our long-term safety and survival as human beings is a bit at stake here, because it's very much linked to environmental sustainability.
And I think taking the example of food, Ray, is a good place to explore, because if you can look at things like diets and the fads that have been circulating around dieting, so the Atkins and the paleo diet, you know, is that a trend? Is that a fad? Is that something that's here to stay? You know, I think clearly, you know, they're demonstrating the behaviors of a fad. You know, if you look at the human needs, you know, the basic human needs around safety and the concerns around those diets is one area. I think the kind of power and influence and the control that you have over oneself would suggest that, you know, they're probably the type of diets and behaviors that may not be here in the long term, but actually taking a more sustainable approach to dieting and your choices, both in terms of your own personal health, but also the wider environment, leans towards more, you know, the idea of veganism or taking a kind of plant-based diet. Certainly starts to see and help you identify, you know, how you would use these frameworks to differentiate, you know, one from the other.
Now, there's a part of our business adversity, we specialize in diversity and inclusion. And of course, it really matters for the business survival for us to answer that question. Is diversity and inclusion a fad or a trend? And we clearly came to the view that it's much more than a fad, because it does meet important human needs, and it's underpinned by a range of factors, right? So, for example, at the demographic level, we have globalization, which means that there are many more, that migration in and out means that there are people from the world over who come to live in the same space in the way that wasn't possible before. We have an aging population, which means that looking after the perspectives of older people and young people, people from different ethnic minority backgrounds matters. You have identity politics, which means that everybody's identity as women, as LGBTQ+, as disabled people, as people from working class backgrounds, all of that begins, there's a real kind of long-term call for recognition. It's supported by technology because people's sense of community and identity is no longer tied to a particular place, as used to be the case for millennia. I think it's much more linked to shared interest, shared identities, the people that are similar to you that you want to connect with over geography is part of your, you know, is made possible by technology. So we can see that, we can anticipate anyway that this is going to be here to stay. Clearly in the UK, the legal framework has changed. In a generic way, there's of course the equalities legislation, which forces organizations to be proactive in terms of how they're going to address diversity and inclusion and take proactive, not just reactive steps, but proactive steps to avoid not only direct discrimination, but indirect structural discrimination. So it forces companies to think about this in a very different way. There's so that's probably enough to give you a sense of why we think that it's here to stay. Clearly, having your identity, your sense of self, your history, your culture recognized is a very deep human need. So people want to feel that they belong and they are included and that they have the same life chances as everybody else, regardless of their background, right? They want to be free from discrimination, from oppression. They want to have the same opportunities to access power, to have influence. They certainly want to feel free from, they want to feel safe. They don't want to feel that they could be the victims of hate crime, that kind of stuff. Or just of, microaggressions at work or in public, for example. So we think that for structural reasons and because it meets very deep human needs, this diversity and inclusion, or the preoccupation with that, is not a moment in history. I think it's something that is here to stay. It might hopefully normalize. It might become much more mainstream and part of the way we just lead our lives without having to be the focus, like an exclusive area of focus. Inclusion should become the norm as opposed to a focus of diversity. But this is a first step, I think, towards normalization. Maybe it's a bit easier to discuss that if we think about a very specific case. And we could have talked about anything, really. Veganism is as good as anything, but we just thought, let's focus on LGBTQ travel for a minute. Something that I reckon a lot of people would think, that's a bit niche. I'm not sure that there's any long-term trend here. So we kind of applied our analytical framework to understand LGBT travel and to see whether there actually is a long-term business opportunity there that would require hotels and tour operators and online and offline travel agencies to change the way in which they're servicing a population, or whether business as usual is good enough. So we looked at briefly, kind of examples of legal factors. It's interesting. We are celebrating 50 years of the decriminalization of homosexuality in this country. So that's at the legal level. There's, we're getting into a much, much, much better place, and attitudes have changed, which as a result, often is the case actually following a change in the legislation, public attitudes change. But what we are also seeing much more recently is, of course, the legalization of same-sex marriage. And that means that if you only looked at the figures in terms of the number of LGBTQ people who travel in order to go to it's called a lesbian party, so a lesbian hen do, or a stag do, or a honeymoon, on honeymoon, or to attend a wedding of friends abroad, you would think, wow, this is a massive trend. We absolutely need to take this seriously. And in fact, the reality is that there's probably a lot of pent-up demand, because a lot of same-sex couples who are now getting married who couldn't get married before. So yes, there's a trend, but probably we're witnessing a little bit of a bubble, and we need to be sensitive to that context. Eventually, LGBTQ plus people will simply travel like everybody else and get married abroad, but at a much more normal rate, much like the general population, as opposed to this huge demand that we're seeing now. Technologically, of course, online travel booking has revolutionized the sector, and that's going to apply to everybody, more likely to have an impact on the LGBTQ plus population for different reasons. One, they're more likely to be online. B, they're more likely to be young, and therefore more versed technologically and used to, they're digital natives in the main. But also their sense of community, as I said, is very much disconnected from just a shared geographical place or space, and much more to a kind of widespread LGBTQ plus community. Public attitudes and political attitudes are changing. There is, in my lifetime, it's the biggest change in in societal attitudes that I can think of. I don't think that attitudes to gender or race have changed at anything like the pace at which attitudes towards gender identity and sexual orientation have changed. And that's really driven by the very strong demand for LGBTQ identity recognition, but it's changing. It's great. Economically, we can see that there's a big opportunity there. In the US, annually, the LGBTQ plus tourism industry is estimated at $65 billion. In the EU, it's 50 billion euros annually. So that's a big opportunity. It doesn't mean, as I said, that it's going to carry on at the same level for the reasons I've just explained, but it's something to take seriously. So the UN has estimated that by 2030, 180 million people will be LGBTQ travelers globally, which is a lot of people. And I have not seen how that figure was calculated, so I quote it, but I'm suspicious of it. So don't take me seriously, and have to look in detail at the Kantar and Hornet report. But they are claiming that 31% of people born after 1999 in the US identify as LGBTQI+, which doesn't mean that they all think that they are gay or lesbian or trans, but probably that they reject a binary gender identity. And in terms of the deep human needs that the LGBTQ+ kind of travel behavior would meet, clearly there's a deep sense of belonging and inclusion in the wider community. People don't want to live with shame and secrecy. They would like to be able to lead their lives authentically in public, and that's in their country and abroad as they travel. But the most frequent question that travel agencies get from LGBT people is, how safe is it to travel in a particular country, in a particular city? Where within that can I stay? What's safe? Where am I not going to be harassed? Where can I just be me? What are the social attitudes? And they need reassurances that when they interact with hoteliers, with concierge staff, with room service, when they go to a restaurant, it's going to be a nice experience. They're there to relax. They're on holiday. They definitely don't want to be harassed, right? We know that the LGBT community, as I said before, is developing a really strong political, social, and economic voice that's unlikely to go back in the closet at any time soon. And interestingly, they can play as a community a really important role in shaping culture, especially around human rights worldwide, because all economies rely on tourism, just about, and they are keen, every country is keen to attract more tourism, and they might need to shape up a little bit and be much more inclusive. That's the claim of the UN World Tourism Organization report anyway. Travel for everybody is good, to explore the self, but also the world, but also to explore oneself through travel. And freedom, we can see that, freedom from discrimination and freedom to be oneself in public, these are deep human needs that recognition of the whole variety of gender identities and sexual orientations will meet.
I think what this highlights as well is that actually looking at kind of behaviours and these shifts that are taking place in local markets isn't sometimes enough. So we talk about safety and attitudes towards LGBTQ people in other countries. So not only have you got to understand the travellers that you are supporting from your market, but also the attitudes and obviously the shifts and the change in those attitudes in the destination. So sometimes this does require looking and casting a wider net.
I think there's coming back to the title of the webinar that you suggested, Marie-Claude and Stephen, why and why now? I think some interesting pieces here around this. So why is it happening and why is it happening now? Well, we can see all of those background structures that you've talked about, And I love the point you made, Marie-Claude, about the pent-up demand. So a lot of the marriages that are happening now are happening because they couldn't happen before, and we would expect that to be a normal rate in the future. One of the reasons why there has been specialist LGBTQ travel in the past is not everybody welcomed people. They weren't reasonable. And we've had attitude shifts and legal shifts. So now in the UK, a hotel can't reject a same-sex couple. So I wonder if the next stage, and some of those whys are going to start changing, maybe most members of the community will not want to travel specifically with members of their community, but actually will just travel along the same lines. They won't need to go to specialist travel agencies. They won't need to double check, is that hotel going to be friendly or accommodating? And certainly when I think of most of the gay and lesbian couples I know, most of their friends are straight. Most of the people they go on holiday with are straight, to use a very old-fashioned phrase, and probably not a good phrase. And I wonder if some of those whys and why nows will also point towards changes in the other direction of having a less specific community here. But then when we start thinking about traveling to Russia, the Middle East, Africa, those whys become really important again.
Yes, I think that's a really good point. It's all about the structural factors in a sense, right? So things change in one country at a very different pace from another country. I think in the Netherlands, for example, and in Germany, things moved faster than in the UK, and the UK they're moving much faster than in France, for example. So yes, and you're absolutely right. The whole point is to reach normalization, where people, LGBTQ plus people, feel absolutely safe and happy to have perfectly normal, confident, relaxed interactions with everybody else, regardless of their sexual orientation, travel together, and not give too much thought, in the same way that I take my sexuality for granted and my gender identity for granted most of the time as a straight woman, cisgender, right? But it's not happening now. And even when it does happen, there will still be probably the need for a gay couple, for example, to communicate with the hotel beforehand and say, as you put these little slippers and robes in the room, can we have 2 for women because the sizes are just a bit different, or 2 for men? It's small stuff that makes a difference.
Absolutely.
Yeah, just to sort of start to wrap this up, really, we thought it'd be really important to think about what some of the implications are, both for researchers, so the in-house researchers or agency researchers, but also for the clients, in terms of understanding whether these shifts are here to stay, why they're happening now, and what that might mean for their investment in research, the methods that they deploy to understand and view and observe these shifts. So a couple of these, we'll sort of talk through these. So I think, the implications for research, the advantages are, I think we'll see more, and we should see more, I should say, strategic projects and probably fewer tactical piecemeal projects. So if you as an organization were looking at the wider shifts in identity, it might negate the need to kind of do ad hoc work just looking at LGBTQ communities, for example. So a different approach to the type of research projects that you commission, a different use of your budget might be one example there. Greater explanatory power and confidence. So, armed with the right information and the ability to make, the right decisions. Enhanced ability to anticipate and predict. So, instead of just getting into a kind of response to something that's already happening, if you're observing and tracking the shifts over time, you can be much better prepared for acting on them through, initiatives, through the development of new products and services, which means that, you'll be earlier to the market, and might be able to grab, a bigger slice of the opportunity before your competitors. So clearly there's some significant advantages there. And, that relevance to the consumer, or that engagement with that consumer audience as they are being at a time where they're more receptive to that message, is really, really important. In terms of setting the brief differently, so the allocation of budgets and resources to other methods than primary research. So thinking about desk research, thinking about literary reviews, and as Marie-Claude touched on earlier, looking at bringing in expert interviews to the fray, I think is really, really important. And I've been involved in a lot of trend research previously, and that kind of triangulation of media scanning, expert interviews, and primary consumer research was always front and center of the approach that we put forward. So and I'd say add on to that the cultural analytics, so using tools like Signoi to analyze huge quantities of unstructured data that you might collect through social media, through social discourse, but also through other data collection that an organization may have, gives you that ability to just track the manifestation and growth of these behaviors and trends over time in ways that wasn't possible, even sort of 5 or 6 years ago, I would say. And I think also about making your research inclusive, or your inclusive insight. I think all too often we see clients, biting off or writing briefs for individual projects with, these small communities, these LGBT communities, using that as an example. But in taking diversity and inclusion as the frame for this, why not make sure that every research brief that you commission or write has an element of diversity in it? And I think that would make for a much more efficient way of using your budgets, and just give you a better way of capturing the similarities and differences in different audiences and different cultures.
I think yes, absolutely. Inclusion is definitely the aim, the end game, right? That's where we want to be. But it's still important to reach inclusion, to begin by focusing at a strategic level, but to begin by focusing on individual communities and their needs and their experiences and their unmet needs and where they want to be, but to build that within the brief, to not reactively think, oh, did we miss something because there's this little niche audience over there. That's not the spirit. The spirit is to make sure that the future is diverse. Let's prepare now for it and make it part of everything we do, right?
Mm-hmm. Marie-Claude, do you want to talk about the agencies?
So, I was just thinking, really, if we adopt that more kind of structural perspective, it changes the way in which we work. It has a lot of advantages. I think from an agency perspective, it does mean that if you spend a bit of time thinking about the structural factors, your whole sector expertise develops much more quickly. And that means, I guess, you can attract much bigger and much more interesting briefs because you are addressing bigger strategic questions. So you report to more senior stakeholders. It means you can grow your accounts much more quickly. And more important, as importantly, I guess, one of the repercussions of that is that if you understand the structural drivers that apply to one sector, many of the trends will also apply to other sectors. So you've really increased your capacity to handle a range of interesting briefs. Now, specifically, it also changes the way in which we respond to briefs. And I think that we all as agencies should think about the makeup of our research teams and have diverse, curious, culturally connected people who understand, who are rooted and have such different life experiences that kind of cognitive diversity and lifestyle diversity really feeds into how we approach a brief much more creatively. It means that the research methods that we adopt should approach or try to understand structural factors, not just individual attitudes and behaviors. It doesn't mean that self-reports are out of the picture. Clearly, you always get inspiration from speaking directly to customers, and you can sense check your sense of what might be the big trend that you've adopted. But it does mean that some resources need to be allocated. You move beyond just asking people for their views, and you look at cultural analytics, at ethnography, online communities, the world in which people live, social media, behaviors, semiotics. You look at not just their views and attitudes and opinions, but at the objects in their world, at the media, the symbols, the images. And as ever, there's nothing quite so useful as comparative analysis, and whether it's an analysis over time or across markets or between segments. And I think building the scope for comparison, and that can mean through purposeful triangulation of methods, is a really, really productive way to look at a brief that seeks to understand trends and not just attitudes.
Yeah.
And I think in terms of these trends and another type of triangulation and another type of why, so we've talked about why and we've talked about why now, but also why do I have something to add to this conversation? I'm thinking about some of the tone deaf trend related things we've seen. So Kyle Jenner and the Pepsi ad was tone deaf. Gillette, and it was looking for this inclusivity that we've just been talking about, but with their best a man could get ads, again, tone deaf. And I think that there is a real role for research, talking to brands and saying, actually, you do not have permission to make that claim. You've got to earn that, and how you earn it is this way.
Yeah, this is really fab examples, actually. Thanks for that, Ray. You're absolutely right. I think this is a case of spotting a trend, and the trend is very real. They're absolutely, the trend is real. The trend for racial justice is real. The trend for gender equality and changing views of masculinity, absolutely real. But it really feels like some smart aleck has latched on a trend and given a brief to an agency that is probably all white and middle class and middle age and has no roots in the communities that they're talking about, and came up with something that felt very much tone deaf. So this brings back in the picture the importance, I think, of really getting testing at minimum your campaigns, your ads, your marketing with customers who are themselves from the backgrounds that you're seeking to portray.
I think for diversity and inclusion as well, this is not as trends go, this isn't and what the behaviors that consumers want from the brands that they buy into is they don't just want to see a campaign with lots of different colored faces in it. They don't want to see a sort of lipstick approach to it. It has to be culturally very deep within the organization. It's about the people that they employ. It's about the policies they have in their supply chains. It's about how they service and support the communities that they seek to engage with. And I think all too often, the advertising industry thinks that they can create something, fairly short-termist, and it will position those brands with authenticity. And clearly, consumers now, again, through the technological changes, are able to vocalize their opinions and rally support very quickly. And so brands like Gillette or Pepsi Cola, or a more recent example would be the Peloton advertising campaign that went live just before Christmas, which again had some fairly poor, as a concept, it wasn't a bad advert, but I think in terms of the execution of it, there was a very poor representation of the woman at home, the keeper of the family, if you like, that really jarred with what consumers felt was just an authentic view of that type of person. So yeah, it's these are shifts. The shift there is actually, the way that consumers feel and react to marketing and campaigns now, as much as our take on identity and the world's, view on how identity has shifted, or how masculinity and toxic masculinity has evolved.
It's also interesting that the legal framework is changing. So now ads that are deemed to portray women in a stereotypical way, typically as kind of passive and a bit dumb, and are going to be banned. And the latest one that was banned was about what was the company? I can't remember, but it was referring to the line was something like, "You do the girl boss thing, I do the SEO." And the idea of the girl boss was so patronizing that the ad was banned. So this is kind of costly, right? No company wants to go through this. And just a little bit of consumer research with women might very well have picked up on that. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think we probably should be moving ahead to questions.
Okay.